I was telling Chris that there's a direct correlation between dancing in the metaverse and being Gen X.
Yes, like Moret. It is, and it makes us feel good because the world is on our shoulders. So easy, okay?
Also, let them know that you made fun of me for being millennial, but being a classic self-involved millennial, I've already put it up on social media to be made fun of publicly.
Yeah,
So.
just I guess that's probably the best way to start. Dave's starting with moisturizing pads on his eyes, chore jacket, and house slippers today. So he's very comfortable in his PI place. Welcome to Orion Growth Open Campus Community powered by Verbella. Dave Cairns, obviously, our moderator, my co-conspirator, and I are both happy to have you here today. Couple of pieces of housekeeping for those of us who haven't been here. John Ramser, who's here waving over there, is here from Orion. He's capturing the footage from today's discussion. So feel free to introduce yourself and talk to him about your experience. We'll be publishing today's discussion in full length and uncut on our YouTube channel, the Orion Growth YouTube channel, when we're done. So whatever you say is going to go out there to the world. Here, Sarah is the VIP of Community for Open Campus, the rock star that she is, and her team at Octosmos, Michael, worked tirelessly to get everybody accommodated. So for getting Dwayne and Drew set this week with the tech issues and the general wayfinding, we appreciate you a bunch. Okay, well, let's welcome our two guests. I'll start with Drew. Drew's the Director of Global Partnerships at Avenue of the World School, founded in 2012 with a mission to redefine schooling for fast-changing world. Today, Avenues is proud to operate as one school across 6 continents in leading cities around the world, serving students from age 2 to 18. They have locations in New York, Sao Paulo, Shenzhen, Silicon Valley, and online. Drew, welcome.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you bet. And we also have with us Dwayne Matthews, who's the Chief Innovation Evangelist and Education Strategist at Tomorrow Now Learning Labs. He's a leading voice for the future of education who helps heads of state, education leaders, and schools prepare students to thrive in a digitally transformed world. We are so glad to have you here with us today, Dwayne.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Well, Dave, over to you, my friend. Let's get this thing going.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thanks for everyone who's here. I'm very excited to have this conversation as I feel very much like a lay person when it comes to the future of education. But I have a 5-year-old girl who I care deeply about, and I want a really cool future for her. So Dwayne and Drew, thank you for lending us your insights today. All right, I'm just going to kick it off with a bit of an intro. So COVID obviously changed the world of work permanently, but until I spoke actually to Chris Muller's nephew on the UMaine College campus about his pandemic high school experience, I really had no idea that the same seemed to be true for many school-age kids. It turns out that Evan had the same experience we all had. He was able to streamline his day and reduce the number of hours of work while being more productive. Essentially, he didn't have to pad his day out like many have complained about in the working world for years. He was able to prioritize his physical and mental health by making his own meals, exercising, and going for walks. And he felt more in control of his life because he was experiencing this thing called autonomy. Turns out is a basic human need. And when I asked Evan if he got lonely, of course he said he did, but he was quick to remind me that he felt it was his own responsibility to solve this problem for himself, not his schools. So suffice to say, the conversation took me a little bit by surprise. Then a few months later, I was back on Prince Edward Island where I live, and I ended up in a chat with a restaurant server who was also in high school. Let me know that he'd been doing online school well before COVID, just to be clear, not home school from his parents, but online school, and that he had always loved it. He cited a lot of the same reasons that Evan had went on to tell me about, and he explicitly said to me that he did not like the conventional school in particular because it resulted in forced socialization between him and people that he didn't necessarily want to hang out with. He much preferred engaging with people in his immediate community at the activities that he enjoyed, and also within a WhatsApp group for island kids to meet each other. On the WhatsApp thing, he told me that he had to self-select himself out of some toxic group chats, but overall he loved it, and that he met his best friend who actually helped him find the job as a server resulted in the very conversation we were having. So talking to these two younger folks, it really blew my mind, and it made me realize that the tensions within the traditional education system were deeper than they appeared. It also brought into focus how often we assume we know what's best for kids, just like bosses assume that they know what's best for their workers. And so I don't tell this story to romanticize flexible and or remote education, but they are real stories, and I think they serve as an important reminder of power dynamics. Bosses think they know what's best for workers, and parents / the traditional education system often think they know what's best for students. But perhaps we don't know everything, and maybe right now we don't even know anything. And that's why I'm so happy that we have Dwayne and Drew here to help us today to bring forward their diverse but complementary perspectives to the dialogue of the future of education. There's arguably not many more topics that are more important with so much upheaval in the world of work and living. It just feels like a really important moment to not lose track of what matters for the next generation. So to kick things off, I kind of want to do a reverse order of how we usually run these conversations. I want to start with the ideal future state and then kind of go from there. So my first question, and I'm going to kick it over to Drew, what will become the typical way we educate our kids in the future? Or will there even be a typical way? I'm just trying to understand from each of your perspective where you think we should be trying to get to.
Oh, it's such a great question, Dave. I don't know if there's ever going to be a typical way, because I don't know if there's ever going to be a typical kid, right? And I think in a perfect world, what we're striving for is the capacity to personalize an educational pathway for each kid that kid themselves can take full ownership over. And what I've found to be so powerful, I think, in these last few years is that through some of the technological conduits that we have, we're able to give kids more autonomy, more self-determined learning spaces and environments for them to engage in. And hopefully we continue that trend.
Dig it. Well, I'm hoping we can get it a little bit deeper, but Dwayne, why don't you kind of start us off again here with what you think in maybe a little bit different or arguably deeper way, how we get to a future state that you think is ideal?
So, I think one of the big pieces about the future of education, and this is piggybacking a little bit off of what Drew said. And I don't know if you guys know, Drew and I actually know each other, and a lot of our views are quite similar. I don't think collectively, if we added all the time together, that we've spoken for more than maybe 48 hours in life. But it's sort of wild how many similar ideas that we have. But I think the key is going to be that we're moving from a one-size-fits-all to something that's highly customized based on the type of lifestyle that a person would like to have. And so if you go back and you think about technology, it typically provides that opportunity to have more autonomy, but also to have more humanity, right? And so I think the technological capabilities actually will increase our humanity dramatically. And once we do that, I think then what we decide to learn, when we decide to learn, changes, because the urgency of, getting out at a specific time and that sort of stuff starts to fade away. We start to think about how would we like to live. So some people would like to live on an island. Some people would like to live in big groups. Some people would like to live in smaller communities. Some people are going to want to live in big cities. And I think all of those things will create the kind of pathway looking backwards that a person is going to want to choose. And then if they do get to a particular destination that they don't like, they can choose another pathway. So I think the first thing that I would think about is, and we're starting to see it already, is the idea of school coming to some sort of an end is going to change. And that's already started to change. The idea of one specific pathway to get into one type of economy of life will change. And I think those kinds of options and having to interchange those kinds of options are what's going to help us to increase our humanity. And I'll say this last piece, in 1820, the vast majority of people on planet Earth were farmers. And so we spent a significant amount of time farming. And today, most people are unable to farm. And in the Western world, our problem is not too little food. Our problem is really food distribution and too much food. And so there's this weird opportunity that technology brings where it provides a significant amount of cognitive surplus, and that provides an opportunity for us to increase our humanity.
Ooh, I like that, cognitive surplus. That's a buzzword of this session. Drew, I want to pass it back over to you before we move into another phase of the conversation. One thing that comes up a lot when talking about children, and it's even been weaponized in the future of work conversation, is to say, would you ever subject a child to remote learning? Like how terrible that would be for their development and their socialization, et cetera. I'd love to get your general take on flexibility when it comes to school-age children and really all the nuance that may be there on that topic, because I've not spoken to any young children about their needs. The only one that I can say actually is that my daughter said her favorite class going into kindergarten was music. And now she doesn't like it as much because they force her to sit down. Gym has actually become her favorite class, but that's a bit of an aside. I still try to talk to young kids about how they feel about school. But when you talk to high school kids, they speak very much about loving the flexibility. And when I even think of my own wife, when she was growing up, she often didn't feel like she, like she had the energy to go to school a lot of days. So she kind of like went against the grain and didn't go. How do we incorporate flexibility without messing up the development of children?
I think it's a lot. It's very similar to the act of curation that you might have at an art gallery or a museum, right? That capacity to walk into a space and maybe only see one piece hanging on the wall or two very carefully selected pieces hanging on the wall. And there is critical distance between those two paintings, right? And there's space that you can actually kind of breathe in between those pieces. What would happen if the same thing occurs with a traditional school schedule? And I think what's powerful in an online learning environment is a student can wake up in the morning and decide where they want to begin their daily academic journey. And then when they're done with that particular assignment or that particular session where they're going back and forth with peers or with an instructor, they have that same critical distance between their next class and whatever idea they were just wrestling with. So they can take a walk, they can read the paper, they can go for a run, they can go and play tennis, they can go and have coffee with a friend, and then they go back to their work. A student in brick and mortar at 8 a.m. in the morning, whether they like it or not, it's time for math. At 9 a.m., whether they want to or not, they have to go to English class. And at 10 a.m., they roll into history, ready or not. And there's no space other than maybe a little bit of passing, like a few minutes of passing time in the hallway. And the expectation to shift the way you think is meant to be seamless. And we've done this for centuries now. And what I've noticed both with the students that I've worked with very closely now for maybe like the last 4 years at Avenues Online, the virtual campus of Avenues, the World School, and with my own daughter, who's now in second grade and spent about 2.5 months last year in an online environment at Avenues Online. What's so remarkable is kids love having that sense of agency where they get to make the decision around how that day starts. And by doing so, they look at school differently and they look at those moments of learning differently. And I think the moment that you can increase the level of engagement for a young person, the dosage can actually be shorter because they're going to accomplish a lot more in a shorter, more compact amount of time. And what that ultimately does is free up more time to, as Dwayne said, be human. Then it feels like as we continue to push more and more into these technological spaces, how do we carve out more time for a young person to connect to the things that cannot happen technologically? And I think having a great approach to how you schedule a learning environment suddenly makes a huge, huge difference.
That was the best shit I've ever heard in my life.
You probably need to hear some more things then, because if that's the high watermark, but thank you.
Schedule, boom. Engagement, boom.
Well, like, yeah, I like the dig too, because I think that really even almost brings it home. You've just articulated exactly what the whole thesis behind flexible working is, and made it clear that it so too should be provided to children. So why it's so good is you just said it so eloquently, and you busted all the myths and made like I don't feel like anyone could argue with you. Is kind of why I thought it was so good.
What's funny, Dave, is that I like this idea. I know Dwayne likes this idea too. And not everybody is on board with it. Even people who have totally embraced the idea of professionals being granted the full control over those dials around space and time, and where they choose to work and when they choose to work, provided that the outcome is the work is done and it's done to the standard that's expected in that particular space. I remember reading the manifesto from all of the Apple workers who were complaining about Tim Cook trying to get them to come back to the office. And one of the things that jumped out at me in that manifesto was they said, it's not like we're supposed to be high schoolers who need to be told where to go, how to take class, and when to do their homework. And I'm like, my gosh, if you are equating that kind of pressure to conform to these schedules that no longer apply in the modern world, and not seeing that it can be just as different for a young person who's trying to learn as it is for a professional working in the real world, I'm very concerned at your capacity to see this new model of education being the way forward, because you think that there's a different set of rules that should be applied to a young person as opposed to you as a professional. And that was really concerning to me.
Yeah, I dig it. Dwayne, before we move to the second question, I'm curious, are there any things that jump out to you that parents can do to support their children that are in these more traditional environments? And I'm really asking actually for myself, because my daughter is not a typical kid the way she thinks. She's in a great public, school, but I'm already seeing how what Drew described of these prescribed times to do these prescribed things are going to continue to weigh on her. And at the moment, I don't really have a different option. So what is anything I can think about differently?
Yeah, no, I would reach back around to Drew and sign up. No, what
Okay.
what I think is important when you look at your own children is to lead with strategy first, not tactics first, right? And so there's a quote by Sun Tzu that I love. The quote is, strategy without tactics is a long road to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And what we typically do is we sort of just tactically follow along a lot of times. Okay, I'm supposed to send them to school, and I'm supposed to tell them to listen to the teacher, and I'm supposed to tell them to try their best to get A's, and I'm supposed to tell them to sit still. But instead, maybe it's to look at, what's that end result look like? What type of human being would I like to encourage you to be? And what type of lifestyle in general would I like you to have? Not what do I want you to do, or what job do I want you to have? Not you being exactly like me, but what are the big broad pieces, right? So what's the character? What's the principles? What kind of lifestyle? By lifestyle, how are you going to sustain yourself? How will you shift when the environment around you shifts? And when you do that, it starts to take the pressure off of the 192-day sprints that your child is in, right? And so the 192-day sprint, there's a teacher in front of them, and that teacher acts like we see the teacher is almost like a deity, right? Like when I went to school, I can remember my aunt saying, make sure you listen to the teacher, no matter what the teacher says, right? You just listen and it's going to be good. But now it's really thinking about, if I can think about where I would like you to be, then I can now start to say, okay, now that I can see what that north is, what that common north is, I can now start to think about what tactics fit into that particular space, right? So I have seen since COVID, some people are like, family comes first and community comes first. They'll pull their children out of school for 3-4 weeks at a time, and they're off somewhere else, and they're taking something that's online. I did strategic planning at another online school, and some students, what they did, instead of taking 7 courses across a day, or 4 now and 3 on a second term, the students took 1 course online for 1 month, and then they focused for 2 hours a day, and then they focused for the other 4 hours doing something else, whether it was playing hockey or traveling or journaling or engaging in different spaces. And so they really embrace the flexibility. And I think once you think about what that flexibility is, and you think about what that lifestyle is, and really think about it, right? You can then go back and start to think, what tools, techniques, and opportunities do I leverage to increase the probability of getting to that North Star? And I think that's super helpful. I'll give you an example. With my son during COVID, my son is the co-founder of Tomorrow Now Learning Lab, and we created what I thought were really cool things, and we had a great time. And at some point he's like, hey, you know what? I'm interested in young women. I'm interested in girls, and there are none in our learning lab because it's just you and me. And so we started out in 2020, and it was sort of like my son, and he thought of me as like a superhero. And a couple years later, I lost all of my shine, and he was interested in being in physical school at a certain place. Will that change in a couple of years? It might. And he should be able to have that kind of flexibility, because one of the things that he would like to do is really sort of embrace his ability to be social and to be a social leader. And so he needs to be in a lot of dynamics. We're very cognizant about how we move him through. He's moved to 4 or 5 different schools. One was French immersion, one was a STEM school, and he's thrived at all, but we've moved him around so he'll have all these different experiences, because we're thinking about the common north. We're thinking about what is that future state versus, hey, you need to get an A on this particular test tomorrow.
Oh, man, I love that. And another sort of like negative bias that you're busting with that commentary is the idea of changing jobs, and how it's seen to be a negative thing. And a lot of younger people are doing it, and for all the right reasons that you kind of just described. And I love it. Thank you for that, Dwayne. For the middle part of this conversation, really interested in actually what you are most afraid of, or what keeps you up at night when it comes to the future of education. So really just simple as that, Drew, like the fever dreams you have.
Yeah. Oh boy. I mean, I think right now it's about misinformation and disinformation, because the tools that you can use to disseminate that are almost undetectable to a young person who doesn't yet have the full sophistication to understand and appreciate where all of those tools sit, where they're from, and how they've been trained. And so they might be getting a very, very biased answer as they try to do a general, at one point it used to be a Google search, and now it might be prompting ChatGPT to help illuminate an issue that you've just discovered. And so I think I'm very concerned around who ultimately is training the models, and then also how are we developing the digital literacy skills to not only teach a young person how to leverage some of these tools for their own advantage, right, which they're going to have to do, but also how to vet some of the information that back their way. Because that's going to be the most important skill. Not how do you access information, but how do you suddenly like find a true signal through all of this like really deafening noise.
Dwayne?
I agree wholeheartedly with what Drew said, and I'll add a couple of pieces. Algorithmic nudging, via digital applications is concerning to me. So I'm concerned about nuance. So I've heard a lot of people in my space complain about screen time. And I don't think that that's nuanced enough. I think people say, I think the kids are addicted to their phones, and I completely disagree. I don't think kids or adults are addicted to phones. I think they're addicted to very specific applications on their phone. And I think getting down into that nuance is important. Understanding, algorithmic nudging and the fact that we exist in the era or economy of attention is important. I think some of the things that concerns me, though, is that we still spend a significant amount of time training students to compete against the machine. And we spend less time training students to really sort of expand their humanity and ability to think. And I think those things sort of concern me because it moves very slowly at scale. And the world around is moving very quickly. That said, I am probably disproportionately optimistic because I think that we typically do a very good job at sorting these things out when the vast majority of us put our mind to it. And I started out talking about the future of education a lot in 2016. And in the last year, a lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people are reflecting on it, and lots of different models are sort of percolating up. And I find that extremely exciting because it means that we're going to get an opportunity to see a lot of different models, which is precisely what we need.
Awesome. Drew, is there anything else on this topic of fear or stuff that's really important to be worried about that comes up for you before we move on ahead?
I mean, I think the things that Dwayne and I are talking about right now are probably the biggest rocks that we could kind of identify. But I'll name one that's maybe a little less obvious because it's kind of always been there, and that is we look at the measures for student success in the wrong way, right? We're still putting an undue emphasis on grades and test scores. And these, kind of spreadsheet statistics that don't really hold a lot of water once you hit the adult world. And I would love to see a shift away from metrics that don't matter into maybe some more real world accountability and responsibility and the building of portfolios so that when you are trying to assess what a kid can contribute, that kid can open up a portfolio and tell you, it's like, here's stuff that I've built, here are things that I've done, here's my capacity to actually roll up my sleeves and engage in the real world, and not just show you a historical mark of how I was performing on a benchmark test last September that actually has no bearing on what I'm able to do right now in this moment in time. And so I would love to see a shift in how we start to, air quotes, assess students.
Yeah, man. It's crazy. These biases are just, you think it's only like a at work thing, but it's really just across the board. And kids are being subjected to it. And then the whole system is honestly built around it. And we're trying to unravel it right now. And I think that this is sort of like how I want to close this out before we go to Q&A. I worry, and I even know I have my own bias towards traditional education. That's probably it's more on the subconscious side. But I just said something earlier. It was like, what can I do as a parent who basically doesn't have any options? And Dwayne's response was sign up for Drew's school. And my physical body jolted because I'm like, oh man, my kid doing online school? Like, what if that screws everything up? Or what if I end up having to be, at the mercy of, quote unquote, dealing with them while I'm trying to figure out the rest of my life? So like, how do we actually do something about changing the overall perception of education for parents and for educators today in 2023 and 2024 with the backdrop of like how challenging it's been to do that with work, right? Like I just read a book called Remote No Office Required, written by the guys that started 37 Signals. It was written in 2013. If you read that book, everything that was said a decade ago has been said on social media by a much larger number of people who have figured it out in the last couple of years. But it's not new. It's, you know, this whole thing has existed for a decade. So like making the meaningful change with so much cognitive bias is the thing that really confuses me a lot. So what are your thoughts on that? Whoever wants to start off.
Go ahead,
So,
Dwayne.
yeah, no, so I'll go and I'll say there's a great book, a great series of books by the late Clayton Christensen, which talks about disruptive theory and the innovator's dilemma. And they're business books, but I would suggest anybody to look at them because he really talks about systems, and he talks about incumbent structures and how do you disrupt an incumbent structure. I think a big part of the problem is, and I had a conversation with the principal. She's like, I still have teachers that don't want to do X. And that's the problem. I go, the problem is you think that everybody's going to jump all at once. You are trying to place a one size fits all with another one size fits all when the problem is the one size fits all in of itself. And so it takes a bit of a shift. And so one of the reasons that we created Tomorrow in Our Learning Lab was just to do that, just to create small labs. Say, we're not here to convert everybody. We're here to attract the converted and to create a demonstration to say, this is something that's pretty interesting. It may not work for everybody, right? It may not work for everybody all the time. My son loved it. He loved not being in school and he loved the autonomy. But once he got to a certain age, he was willing to give up some of his autonomy to go into a brick and mortar environment, right? And that may not necessarily be the same, right? My wife loved school in grade 9 and 10, and by the time she got to grade 11, she was like, feel like I'm a grown-up, I'm ready to go. And grade 12 just seemed like an annoyance, right? So I think, not thinking that everybody needs to go, but thinking what is the best scenario for you in that moment in time that works for the specific lifestyle, right? Like, how does that work for the lifestyle? Like, when I look at what lifestyle do I want to have, I don't restrict that to Canada. I think where on planet Earth am I going to get the most things that I like for me and my family? I could move to Botswana, right? And so I think it's really important to think about what are those specific nuances and not necessarily to look at, gosh, we need to change the entire education system. That's one other thing. The other that I would say, if we wanted to get more strategic, then I would say, think about how do we optimize for function versus form. So typically what we do is we optimize for form. We have an innovative moment and we create a form, and then we try to have these incremental improvements on it over time, right? Like really small incremental improvements over time. And we don't necessarily think about optimizing for function, right? Which is, what is it that we're trying to do? I'll give you an example. We've created school based on 600-year-old technology, if you judge it by Western standards, printed book. And the printed book has a limitation in terms of technology. It's not mobile. It seems mobile, but it's not. There are only so many books that you could carry at once. If you can only carry so many books, and books are hard to come by, it means that you have to come to a centralized place to get that information. And it means that for you to move on to the other set of books which are limited, you have to prove that the last set of books you took in mastered. And so we've been stuck with an optimized version of that form of school. Well, we'll make the assessments different. Maybe we'll make them more interesting. Maybe we'll make them project-based. But at the end of the day, the classroom looks like there was one adult at the front of the room. There is some kind of board somewhere, some version of a blackboard, which was invented in 1801. And you have to memorize the content in a book or in semiotic structures of words. And you have 192 days to do it. and then you move to the other when you've proven that you've memorized, because you can't walk with 1,000 books. But guess what? Today we can walk with 1,000 books, right? Today we can walk with all the books. And so we actually need a different skill set. But if we focus on the function, what is it that we're trying to do, right? So I challenge teachers and educators and leaders in governments. You have an education system. Why? Why do you have one? Right? People say, I'm trying to teach kids. I go, kids can teach themselves. They have all the tools to teach themselves. So why do we have it? Right? What is it for? And once we start thinking about that, now we can optimize for that function. Right? Now we can optimize for that function. And I think once we start to do that, opportunities will start to present themselves. We have a strategy and a common north. We'll start to say, I can curate a bit of this. I can curate a bit of that. Right? So maybe I go talk to Drew, and for 2 years it works for my daughter. Maybe on year 3 it doesn't work because I'm busy and I can't have her in the house. So I'm going to need to have her do something else. So maybe she's going to brick and mortar school. Maybe she's going to some kind of camp. I don't know, but you'll start to curate all those things once you start thinking, what is the common north? So I think we need to get back to optimizing for function, and we will find we have a significant amount of tools that we can pull, curate, and put into protocols that will be productive based on the function.
Thank you. Another mic drop. Drew, I have another question that I just became interested in my head, but if you have
Sure.
a lot of other things to say on this, I could not ask that one.
I mean, I think Dwayne's answer is beautiful. There's all sorts of things that I could tag on, but let's go in whatever direction you think is best for the group, Dave.
Okay, well, whether it's best for the group or it's best for me, we'll find out. But I'm really interested in what you guys actually think of this modality for learning, particularly for kids going forward. And the quick stat I'll list is that Gen Z is spending more time in Roblox than they are on TikTok or they are on any other virtual platform combined. So what do we think about being inside these types of worlds?
I think there's potential in all of it, right? And I think I'm a big Ethan Mollick fan. He's a professor over at Wharton. And one of the metrics that he's trying to use around the impact that AI has in terms of the education space, he calls it best available human. And it's like, so if you're in a space, you have to ask yourself, is there a better human being that I could talk to other than the AI chatbot that I have access to? And really kind of equating that with a human sensibility to a degree, obviously. And so I think the question I would have as an educator, as I look at this particular virtual space, and I have not even spent a full hour in it yet, right? So I wouldn't want to pass judgment on it at all. What I think the question that I would always lead with, and I imagine Dwayne would agree, is simply this: like, is the leveraging of this new tool going to improve the learning outcomes of our students? And if the answer is yes, even if that answer is yes ultimately, right, so it's going to take a little time to get there, but it will create a better learning environment and a better learning outcome that can endure, then I would suggest that we as educators and we as parents who have children who are trusting them to other educators encourage that type of innovation to take place. If the answer is no, then we have to look towards something else. But again, I am certainly not at a point yet where I could say yay or nay. What I can say, though, is I think the capacity to bring people together in spaces that are not geographically locked, there's a challenge with a brick and mortar, right? A brick and mortar institution, that school's community, even if it has, a high number of students and families who've come from all around the globe, they're now all living locally. And so their context and their point of view is going to be influenced by the fact that they're all within a gas tank away of the location where the air quotes learning is happening. But in a space like this, the potential to bring people together from halfway around the world for two students to read the same text, but to lens that text in a radically different way because of what's outside of their actual window as opposed to the virtual one, and then to come into this space and talk about that same book in two radically different places, or in two radically different ways, and have everyone else around the table go, it's interesting hearing both of these people talk about a book that sounds as if they didn't read the same thing that I read. That kind of opening up of the dialogue and that capacity to create more powerful spaces where empathy can be experienced, I think is a it's a really powerful tool, and I'm excited about the potential around that as a concept.
Man, this is top conversation we've had out of 17 so far. Dwayne, do you have any thoughts on that before we go to Q&A?
Sure. So I really appreciate Drew's comments. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, and I'll go a roundabout way for this, is that, I was born in Toronto, but I spent my formative years in the twin island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, a small country off the coast of Venezuela. And the reason that I came back to Canada was two reasons. A, I wanted to swim in the Olympics, which never happened. But B, my mom wanted me to have an opportunity for school. And why did she want me to have an opportunity to school? Because the physical schools that I had access to were limited in terms of my ability to access them. So we had to write an exam, and only 20% of the island would get to go to what we call prestige schools. And so if you didn't make one of the top prestige schools, you ultimately had no access to the best books and the best libraries and so on. And you did that at 11. That's not unusual for most places around the world. Most places around the world, school is, you have a massive amount of stranded brilliance because of the exclusionary nature of school. And a big part of that exclusionary nature is based on geography, neighborhood, country, etc. With platforms like these, and I think what's interesting is now that people can start to imagine, what it's like to be at different places around the world. Roblox is interesting because people can create some of those spaces. And to Drew's point, they can interact with different people. When we did our project at Tomorrow Learning Lab, we used a VR headset, and the idea was to bring in students from different socioeconomic and geographic stratospheres. And it was interesting, to Drew's point, the perspectives that they brought. So one of the things that I have noticed when I speak to a lot of, thought leaders and intellectuals, that they see the world from their perspective and believe that it's the whole perspective, right? They're like, yes, we're the leaders in this particular space. And so they'll say the future of education needs to be X. They won't consider what the future of education needs to be in Kenya versus India versus Pakistan versus Indonesia versus Trinidad versus Guyana. No, they think Western perspective from the group that I'm around, or if I'm around another group, let's say in the south of Africa. And so I think spaces like these, they create a bit more opportunity for people to interact, and a bit more opportunity for people to see certain possibilities and to start thinking about, how does that interact with the way that I view the world? And what can I learn from that? I lived in South America for 2 years in Peru. And when I came back, people said, did you learn about Peru and the Peruvians? And I said, I didn't really learn that much about the Peruvians. I learned a lot about myself, because my entire culture, perspective, and everything slammed against this perspective and this culture that was so different from mine, that I got a chance to see myself a bit more clearly. And it forced me into a state of academic humility, because I realized that the way that I saw the world was not necessarily the way that the world was, it was the way that I was. And so I think these kind of spaces create those kinds of opportunities.
Well, I'm really glad I asked that question.
Oh, so am I.
Yeah.
So am I.
With that, I'll pass it over to Chris. Thank you,
I don't
guys.
even, guys, that was epic. I don't even really know how to transition other than I sort of have to stop and double click on this notion of the 600-year-old modality of book because, this year my kids have both in the last 2 years transitioned to two totally different schools, three really. So I appreciate and embody the experiential learning piece of that. But one thing that stood out was my daughter going to her new school this year asked me if I would reach out to the dean and ask if she could write notes in her book. Because going into ninth grade, going into her first experience in high school, she had never been able to actually write in the book because the property was the property of the book.
Mhm.
And that sort of was just sort of this crazy old school notion, right? Like, yeah, when I read a book, I read 70 probably books a year. I tear them up. I read, I fold, I mark right there in the book so that when I can come back, I can revisit. And there's nothing more intimate to, than your own way of reading and acknowledging and relating to the information inside of a book. And to think that you can't even underline or write in it is crazy. So I just wanted to sort of double click on that resonated. Thanks, Dwayne. Lots of really good comments in here. What I really want to do is just sort of start with opening it up to see if maybe Stephen or Chris, you guys have been active in the chat. Do either of you have questions or comments you'd like to share first?
I have something. Oh, Chris raised his hand.
I was in the middle of typing
man.
this. Oh,
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Chris.
Should I go or I can
Please.
defer?
No, please go ahead.
I was saying I was in the middle of typing this, but I'll just try to state it because my head's exploding and there's so many ways that I think we could say education could change and that we can very directly trace that practice to a previous, maybe it was an exigency at some point that even if it was, no longer exists. But I'll just ask this one question, and it's like, you think of basic skills, right? And reading, writing, grammar, facts about, science, and maybe people would learn to read and write without much school. Again, 60% of people, 65%, 70%, and just let them do some minimally self-paced, whatever, after grade 2. But getting more to my point, I think of things like we teach every student in the US some botany, intermediate to advanced botany. And yet they come out and don't give a damn about biodiversity, or we teach them about historical facts and they really can't glean patterns of behavior that repeat. So should we just focus on the upshot? I don't give a damn if my kid knows what photosynthesis is. I mean, that's a basic one that's easy to know, but I want her to know that she needs to oppose anything that's going to extinguish a species. I'd rather have a bunch of kids come out knowing that, and they don't. And it's because we try to jam this technical stuff into their head that only a few students are going to actually need to know when they become scientists. So hopefully that wasn't too inarticulate. And that's one thing I just, as I read the poll numbers for the next year's presidential election and look at the climate summit now, I'm just gosh, my optimism is being tested.
Drew, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. I think our response at Avenues Online in particular, where we've done a real overhaul of what the learning environment has to offer a young person, really starts with this notion of tackling global scale problems, right? So instead of, when you come to Avenues Online, you don't find an English class, you don't find a history class, you even don't have a science class unless you're going to take an advanced science elect later in high school. Instead, what you have is something that we call great works. And we've pulled a text from the fiction side of the ball and a text from the nonfiction side of the ball. And I think at that 35,000 foot level, what we're asking students all the way, from toddler all the way up through 12th grade, why do you think we've paired these two texts together? And we believe that in examining the dialogue that those two authors are having with one another, even if that dialogue is happening across centuries because they're not from the same era, and the dialogue that is then directed from the text towards the students themselves and to that cohort of students who are interacting with those two texts, we then start to better understand that all of the gnarly problems that are facing our planet aren't siloed, right? Like if there were a water crisis in Australia, no one would say to a group of very accomplished adults, you can only use geometry to solve this problem. Instead, we're asked to come up with a really good idea, right? To crack that code. We had a really powerful speaker to the Avenue Silicon Valley campus last spring, and he had been one of the lead designers on the Voyager 2 Golden Disk. And when he was asked what made that interdisciplinary project, which is essentially what it was, so powerful for him, he's like, well, you know, you collect some of the best minds on the planet and none of them could give you a definitive answer to the question that they were trying to answer, which was, how do we create an artifact that will help an alien culture understand who we are? No one knew how to answer that, right? And so you had to get creative in those spaces. What I think we've done with that Great Works curriculum is get away from this notion of teaching kids a bunch of stuff that they might not ever have to use, and instead going, world is a complex place, and solving those issues is going to take you understanding how to deal with complexity and how to deal with collaboration. And if we can lay a foundation with an understanding of complexity and the capacity to build collaborative bonds across cultures, then I think we start with a really good foundation for any of the other learning that happens after that. And the other thing that I want to say to your point, Chris, is that there's a really wonderful magic act that I think wonderful educators can perform for a young person, and that is to get them to engage with an idea that they didn't come up with on their own. Because we as adults who have a little bit more experience on the planet might know that you need exposure to a couple ideas in order to be a little more functional, right? And to have some capacity in the world. And so I think you have to be able to build a swift bond of trust with a young person to then introduce an idea that is potentially essential for their capacity to affect positive change on the planet. And they're willing to give that idea a crack because you see them, you honor them, you appreciate them, and you build your curriculum in such a way that you have 50% of it in your back pocket, and you look around the table at all of the kids who just entered your room and you recognize that they're bringing the other 50%. And when you know how to combine those two things together, I think you're doing something really special in a classroom, whether it's physical or virtual.
That's amazing. It sounds like you squarely have identified your stakeholders and the relationship and correlation between both student and teacher. Thanks for sharing that. I know Sarah and Stephen both have questions, so I'll let the two of those guys fight it out.
You want to go, Sarah? I think you had one from earlier.
I will. Thank you, Stephen. I've been really interested in this conversation. I've spent the last over a decade of my career looking at and working with education and educators in emerging technologies. So this topic is particularly interesting to me, and it's been really interesting hearing the different perspectives around the room. I was kind of noting something said earlier about if the chat bot is equal to or better than the human interaction and improving learning outcomes and things like that. It touches on something that is key to the work that we're doing here in Open Campus. Is kind of intended to be a working example exploring these ideas, and I would definitely encourage everyone to come back because there are literally learners here every day doing this stuff, and it's very fascinating to watch and be a part of. And the key is humans, though, I do believe, and that there's this fallacy in emerging technologies of all kinds of it being sort of the silver bullet for something. And in education and technology on the extreme, it tends to be, the robots teaching the class kind of a thing when they want to be hyperbolic about it. But I do think it's important to point out that having humans behind and with the technology is where it becomes important. It's not about the technology itself. It's about the technology to bring together these quality interactions, regardless of proximity, like was talked about a great deal. And in terms of learner outcome, I think it really does something that I feel is missing in education across the world, depending on where you're looking. But hearing from those that you don't hear from, either whether it's because someone doesn't feel comfortable speaking up in class or participating in a certain way, or they're a person with disability, which means they're not always involved as others are, or they are in poverty, or they're in a country where resources are scarce. But if we can get them the Maslow's hierarchy of technology, basic level of a computer and internet access, of which there's money in the US and beyond that don't, but that's improving, then places like this can really cultivate that ability to bring together. And I just wanted to resonate with that it is this elevating place to give every kid and learner out there access to make their own story, like we've talked about, right? To be able to not be within the constraints of brick and mortar. Someone once said there's literally not enough space on the planet Earth to build enough brick and mortar schools that are needed to educate the people in this world. And I wouldn't doubt it. So let's use this technology to bring people and ideas together, and we will watch these young people shape these. That they're already building these worlds. They're ahead of us in terms of accepting the technology. The educators are the ones that need to kind of meet them there. But it is happening here every day. I guess that's what I really wanted to say, and I'm very excited about it. And I want to share it with anyone that would love to learn. I spoke this morning to some researchers in education that are interested in all of this too. So this is the work that we're doing. So it's very exciting to hear everybody talk about it. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, you bet. Thanks for throwing that out there for us, Sarah. For sure, your
My
work is
passion.
amazing.
Sarah.
It's amazing. So we are at 1:30, and with respect to the fact that some people have a day that's going on around us with time, Stephen, is there something you can say real quick that can add to it, or do we need to table it and bring these guys back for another epic discussion?
I can probably sum up in about a sentence here, instead of
Okay.
making it a long question, just sort of a statement that in all of these new learning techniques and technologies, I think one of the most important parts is our ability to work with the person and understand how they learn. And that even goes into a lot of different subjects. Some people might be tackled with one subject and books and head down with another. And that's just something that's not really addressed in today's schools. So I was going to pose that as the question, but we'll just kind of make that a statement here and just say, it's a very important thing to focus on.
Yeah,
Need another one of these.
As with all of these conversations, especially with epic guests like Dwayne and Drew and Dave asking some really good questions and moving things through, we could probably be here for 3 hours easy.
Exactly.
A lifetime of problems to solve. So if we're okay, I'm going to remove the table. We'll go for a photo shot here real quick. If that'll be all right, we'll come on over to the screens so that we can get some pictures for social for these guys. Thank you, both of you, Dwayne and Drew, for taking the time and adding your insights. That was awesome.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
So if we just want to come on over here and get in the picture, whoever's around, maybe some people might be snoozing away from their avatars for the moment, and that's okay too. But if you can make your way over here and get in the picture, we'd love to have you. Thank you, Universe. Who else is over there?
UNG. Over. Colin. UNG, Colin. And Joel.
Come on over.
I'm looking all festive.
Colin, you coming in? Come smile. All right. And
And then,
Joel,
I'm
come
sorry,
on
go
in.
ahead.
Come on
No,
in,
you're-
Joel. Feel free to
yeah.
jump in.
If anyone's new, there is an emote panel. It looks like clapping blue hands on the right side. You can also do a dance if you're feeling froggy. And just, I would say, go ahead and start emoting away, and I'll be getting some pictures here as we go.
That sounds good.
There we go. Someone found some sounds.
All right.
I'm gonna know.
There.
All right. Well,
There's some
thanks
pictures.
everyone.
Awesome.
Yes. Thank you guys. Dwayne, Drew, we'll follow up later. I got to go pick up a little girl at the school bus, but thanks
All right,
everybody.
thank
I'll
you
be
very
know
here
how
if
that is.
anyone wants to hang
Thanks,
out.
Dave.
Take care,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.